Gareth, in your February poll, the African National Congress had 54%, the DA just over 21%, and the EFF, the third largest party in the country, with some 12%. How fluid are things right now with a week to go before the elections?
Well, things are quite fluid, and particularly fluid with regards to the ANC and the EFF. So in April, we had the ANC down to 49.5 on its baseline number. It does get to 51% on a lower turnout. We had the EFF up to 14.9%, and it stays at about 14% on a lower turnout. The DA is more or less stable, but there's definitely some fluidity between the ANC and the EFF. They seem to be battling over around 5% of alienated black ANC voters, and where those voters end up in a week's time will determine the outcome of both those parties' baseline support.
Gareth, for the first time when I was engaging with people, for the first time, I think in a long time, I'm hearing more people say, I just don't know. How many of those people constitute your survey?
Well, we had about 15% of respondents that said they didn't know one way or the other. Some were around 8% were undecided. Some refused to answer the question. Others said they wouldn't vote. The thing that does make the IRR's poll different, however, is that we are able to allocate undecided and unsure voters to a political party based on their preference as illustrated in other questions in our survey.
Gareth, do people care, leading up to the big day, of course, where their parties are likely to end up? I mean, you have the ANC in the balance on a national level. So if they can't get over the 50% threshold, if you will, they will need to go into a coalition with a smaller party. Do people care who the party they vote for is likely to go into a coalition with?
Yes, I think people care deeply, and they care particularly about those parties that are quite fundamentalist in their character. They tend to be the most divisive. So, for example, the big debate in this election is obviously the EFF, and it's a conundrum for both the ANC and the DA and their respective voters. Should a coalition be formed with that government? Is it dangerous legitimizing the EFF by giving it a share of a formal administration? And I don't think either of those two parties has arrived at a set conclusion on that matter yet.
Gareth, some of the finding, especially with regards to the service delivery protest that we've been seeing, I'm likely to ask, especially when I see ANC's tally in Gauteng, which stands just over 42%. And I wonder how much of your survey touched on those service delivery hotspots like Alexander.
Well, the survey was in the field from the 18th to the 25th of April, and some of those Alex service delivery rights were taking place during that period. So it might have had some influence on the vote shares of both the DA and the ANC. Then again, they both seem to be fairly consistent with our February poll, in the same kind of range and demonstrating the same kind of trends. So I don't think that that particular service delivery incident had a massive impact on the vote.
You say that the DA will benefit from a low voter turnout, that they will get more share of the votes in Gauteng province. Why is that?
Well, it's partly due to the same trend we saw in 2016, where Gauteng voters, far more than the rest of the country, were highly enthusiastic, and DA voters in particular the most enthusiastic. So it gave what we call in the polling business a differential advantage to the DA. In other words, the DA managed to get more of its people to the polls on election day than the ANC managed to get its people to the polls on election day. And it looks like the same kind of trend is set to happen in 2019. So the DA becomes far more competitive on a lower turnout.
The Western Cape still mirrors the kind of power dynamics that's still at play in that province. You have the DA at some 44%, the ANC at 28%. Why do South Africans still vote in blocks, and particularly racial blocks? They don't seem to have changed at all, according to the survey.
Well, that's not entirely true. The DA's support base is, for example, the most diverse of all the political parties. It has 27% of its supporters are black South Africans, around 30% are white, around just under 20% are coloured and around 15% are Indian. And it compares quite starkly with the likes of the ANC and the EFF, which seem to be far more racially homogenous. 96% of all the ANC support comes from black South Africans, 97% of the EFF support. So there is some diversity out there, and there are parties that are racially homogenous. There are different reasons for those, and it's a complex, long answer if you want it in full.
You have the ACDP growing almost double your earlier prediction, at least in the Western Cape. Do you know what's behind that surge?
No, it's very difficult to determine what is motivating and driving the ACDP's vote up in the Western Cape. I think, and this is just my own opinion, it's not based on what the data says, I think it has something to do with a kind of crisis of morality. And when people feel both the governing party, which in the Western Cape is the DA, and the official opposition, which is the ANC, are in something of a crisis, they look to something that offers them moral certainty. And the ACDP, with a kind of hard Christian moral framework, I think provides that for a number of voters in that province.
Gareth, my final question, what's your margin of error with regards to your survey?
So the margin of error for our national sample was 2.8. For each of our provincial subsamples, for Gauteng and the Western Cape, it was 6%.
Gareth van Onselen, the Institute of Race Relations Head of Politics and Governance.